Okay, welcome back to the latest instalment of GBN America with me, Patrick Christys. And today I'm very pleased to be joined by Theo Wold. Now, Theo is an attorney. He was the Acting Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Policy at the Department for Justice and Deputy Assistant as well to the President for Domestic Policy during the Trump administration. So it's a very long business card. He's a very qualified man. I'm certainly looking forward to talking to him about all things illegal immigration. So, Theo, welcome to the show. Great to have you on. First things first, Joe Biden, I believe, is being sued now by Texas and a coalition of Republican-led states because of something called keeping families together. Do you know what's going on here and how damaging it's been for people?
Yeah, so, and thanks again for having me on. So, yeah, this is the interesting aspect of some of the Biden administration's immigration policy is for the first 2 years, really, they were focused on essentially keeping the border open, right? They removed the Title 42 restrictions, the Remain in Mexico policy, the travel restrictions imposed on countries that were non-compliant on security checks, so the so-called Muslim travel ban, if you will. All of those policies that were created by executive order under President Trump, the first thing the Biden administration did was take those down. That led in part to the invasion at the southern border, the 10.5 million people that have entered illegally. What hasn't received as much attention are the policies, the affirmative policies that the Biden administration has put in place, such as this Family Protection Act, the Parole in Place program. And all of these programs are designed essentially to funnel illegal aliens into the country, but in a way that they wouldn't be tabulated as unlawful entries, but instead be calculated as legal entries. And the crazy thing here is we're talking about tens of millions of people, and with the possibility of, through what we call family chain migration, of being reunified with their families and partners, it could be upwards of 50, 60 million people when it's finally finished and all set for in the next 15 to 20 years.
It's absolutely insane. Now, there are a lot of similarities between our two great countries. Illegal immigration is unfortunately one of them, although you guys have it on a much bigger scale. They say everything is bigger and better in America. I didn't realise they were talking about illegal immigration as well. But, you know, our left-wing Prime Minister here, who's new to the job, the first thing he did was get rid of the only deterrent we had, stopping illegal immigrants coming across the English Channel. I mean, your one did something very, very similar, and they're very clever, aren't they? The way that they go about doing this to now make it so that they can fudge the numbers. These people will just be reunited with their own families. They won't be illegal migrants, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it's an absolute shocker, isn't it, really? And, of course, the whole time that this has been going on, I believe, Kamala Harris, the vice president, and in her eyes, soon to be president, has been the border czar. So, kind of go figure when it comes to that. What's she been looking at? Just an open fence?
Yeah, I mean, I think these two ideas are actually kind of linked, right? Which is part of the move by the Starmer government, by Labor for the last, 10, 15 years has been to essentially conceal the numbers coming into the United Kingdom. The same effort is underfoot here in the United States, which is to really hide from the American people. Well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a few 10,000 refugees? Are we talking about 1.5 million legal immigrants every year? Are we talking about 10 to 15 million illegal immigrants? And the role that Kamala Harris has played, very similar, which is she was, as you noted, identified as the point person for the White House on the illegal immigrant problem, the southern border crisis, from the first few months of the administration. And when you go back and you read the contemporaneous news accounts that were written way back when Biden first took office, the issue from her team was, well, hey, the vice president's being cut out of all the important policy work. They're really sort of discriminating against her as a woman and a woman of color. They won't give her a leading role in the administration. She needs something meaty. So the Biden folks gave her something meaty. They gave her, immigration, the biggest, most important portfolio, I would argue, in the White House. And, she essentially mismanaged that. She took a visit to the Central American states, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where she insulted the local leadership. She insulted the business community down there. And, if you remember, her famous phrase was, don't come, don't come, don't come, which, the Guatemalans said was deeply condescending and deeply offensive. And over time, she took less and less of an interest in the actual role, made no visits to the southern border, no visits to Texas or Arizona to see the on-the-ground conditions. That evolved into the present circumstance where now the national media here in the United States is running essentially an embargo on this record and saying, hey, well, this is all made up. Vice President Harris was never the border czar. She never had an instrumental role in immigration policy, and this is just a baseless attack coming from the right wing. It's very, as I said, very similar to the discussion over the numbers themselves. They want to hide from the citizens of the UK or the United States the actual full force of immigration, what it's doing to local communities, and they actually want to hide from you who's in charge. Who made these decisions? And in our instance, it was Kamala Harris, and now we can't even have a robust debate about that.
No, and this is it. This is it. The other aspect, again, massive point of similarity between our two countries here is we have, well, we were supposed to have anyway, a policy that meant that British people would be towards the top of the social housing queue. Okay, that would be something that many people would regard as being common sense, as opposed to someone who has literally just arrived here, especially if they've just arrived here illegally. Okay, that's been scrapped. That's not going to happen now. And I'm reading with some interest about what's going on in Oregon here, because first-time home buyers who are non-US citizens are being encouraged to apply for a $30,000 grant for down payment assistance with the Camino a Casa program, run by the Latino-led Hacienda Community Development Corporation. Now, look, I'm asking for a bit more detail on this from you. So my rough understanding is that they can get given a loan to put down a deposit, but they can also get something like a 0% mortgage anyway, which Americans can't get. Is that right?
That's exactly correct. So they can qualify, and this will be the interesting question, again, as a lawyer, to prove and substantiate their unlawful presence in the United States. But if they can document somehow that they are, in fact, illegal, then they are eligible to receive a zero down, 0% interest rate loan for the purchase of a home. Oregon, like much of the West Coast and the eastern United States, has essentially a housing crisis that's driven in two ways, right? There's a supply problem that is sort of the aftershock of the COVID lockdowns and the supply chain problems that affected most of the Western world. But there's also a demand problem. When you're importing close to 15 million people in the course of 2 years, you're going to see a skyrocketing sort of interest in home ownership and the prices in the market. And so places like Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, they are all facing an enormous housing crisis. And then into this breach steps here in Oregon, a nonprofit organization that specifically favors illegal aliens. And then also you have a proposal from Gavin Newsom in California that would do the same, but through state power, through the state of California, as opposed to a third-party group. All of this, here's the main takeaway. All of this is designed, as is the case in the United Kingdom, as is the case in a lot of the Nordic countries, to eliminate the distinction between citizens and foreign nationals who arrived by boat, by plane, by car just yesterday. That is what's going on. So to give the advantages for home ownership, for healthcare, for education to illegal aliens. And look, this is just the next step of this entire plan. I mean, we've seen it in a place like Denver, Colorado, where the liberal mayor of Denver has given new housing construction to illegal aliens, free health care, and inundated the public schools with illegal alien children. So giving them access to capital to purchase homes on their own, that's just the next step in this same unfolding plan that the left has created throughout the West.
How are Americans standing for this? Because I'm sure you've seen over here, we've had some issues recently, and I'm certainly not condoning any of the some really heinous stuff that took place with people, setting fire to migrant hotels and stuff like that. But the reality with that was that there was those people who did those things, but there are millions of other people who are just very, very, very angry, but didn't want to commit a criminal act. They didn't want to burn something down, right? And I just wonder, how are the Americans dealing with this? You wake up one morning, you've been paying your taxes, you've been just doing enough to keep the food on the table for your kids or whatever, and a housing development comes up in your area, and the mayor that you voted for maybe says, sorry, we're going to give that to people from a different country who've just arrived, and we're going to give it to them for free. I'm sorry, I don't understand what the logic is here. How are the Americans taking this?
Yeah, I think to give you another example where this really comes home for a lot of Americans, there was a woman in California who posted on X a series of photos of her son's barracks conditions. Her son is a United States Marine He was recently assigned to a new room in his barrack, and there was black mold in the ceiling. There was rot around the toilet and the shower. And she said, look, these are the conditions that America's fighting forces in uniform are subjected to. We can't even upgrade or retrofit barracks living, dormitory style living for our Marines, but we're giving free housing to illegal aliens. And I think that's an increasing perspective from a lot of Americans. However, I'll say this. I think Sweden is really instructive here. Much smaller country than the United Kingdom, obviously, or than the United States. A much smaller percentage of illegal migration into the country relative to the UK or the United States. It took Sweden about 15 years to really wrestle with and confront the integration problems, the housing crisis, the healthcare crisis, and the education crisis precipitated by illegal immigration into Sweden. 15 years for a center-right government finally to come to power and say, look, we've got to deal with this head on. And in fact, a lot of the social norms and social values we hold dear here in Sweden are being compromised by the failure of illegal immigrants and this growing refugee and asylee population to integrate into the country. Now, that's Sweden. It took 15 years. The scale of the problem is much more immense in the United Kingdom, much more immense in the United States, and the grip of diaspora politics, the influence of organizations like UCARE or CARE here in the United States to influence immigration policy is enormous. And so I think, look, for every angry American, there's that much more money spent on advertising and influencing and lobbying in Congress to keep the borders open and to keep this pipeline of free entitlement spending and free access to housing, healthcare, education going for illegal immigrants. It's going to be a real challenge, but time is of the essence.
Can Trump do anything about this? Because again, we're staring down the barrel here in Britain, and I think in a lot of European countries actually, of the problem having got to a certain stage where actually without mass deportations, it's not going to change. And then when you get into that territory, it becomes very difficult because, where do you deport some of these people back to? Do the countries accept them back? It also can look very racist, okay? And you've got a ready army of lawyers who are willing to stop all of that happening. So it becomes incredibly unlikely. So in light of the idea that maybe mass deportations can't really happen, what is Trump going to do about this if he comes to power, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and the framing is exactly right. I mean, look, if you go back and you look at some of those speeches that Enoch Powell gave in the 50s and 60s, he predicted some of these circumstances, I think, correctly. But what was missing even then was, whether it's incentivized repatriation or, where you're writing a check to get people to leave or, as you said, using some of the international conventions to send people home. It was, in the practical terms, that's always going to be a really difficult slog. So what can you do in the alternative? I think there's a couple of things that a potential Trump White House, Trump administration could do. One of them would essentially be to enshrine in law through the Housing and Urban Development Department requirements that you verify citizenship or status before you deliver benefits. To give you a real-world example of this, the state of Florida just 2 years ago required under an executive order from Governor Ron DeSantis, and then that was later enshrined in statute by the Florida legislature, that any hospital or clinic in Florida would have to verify the citizenship status of a would-be patient when they arrived at an emergency room or within the hospital. Immediately, almost overnight, the rates of illegal aliens using an illegal alien Medicaid program passed by a Democrat Congress plummeted, just absolutely just disappeared almost overnight, to the extent that migrant-friendly groups were complaining about this, saying Florida has now become inhospitable to illegal aliens seeking out health care. I think that's the kind of initiative that a Trump administration would have to pursue, which is to say, look, if we can get you removed and deport you, we're going to. But in the alternative, we're going to put citizens first by ensuring that for voting, for access to education, for access to healthcare, you've got to prove that you belong here, that you're actually a U.S. citizen before we give you taxpayer money.
Yeah, disincentivise it. Disincentivise it. And I'm not seeing a lot of that at the moment, certainly not where you are, and unfortunately not where I am either. But Theo, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. I know our viewers and listeners will get a heck of a lot out of it. And I do hope to talk to you again very, very soon. So it's Theo Wold there. Make sure you check him out on X. It's at Real Theo Wold. He's, of course, an attorney and was the acting Assistant Attorney General, amongst other things, in the Office of Legal Policy at the Department of Justice, and as well as Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy during the Trump administration. So a very esteemed guest there. Theo, all the best. Take care. I'll talk to you again very soon on GBN America. That's it from me today. But make sure that for all of your latest news, you go to www.gbnews.com/America. See you next time.